In May 1940, just 8 months into the war, MI5 and Special Branch swooped on locations in central London.
Yeah.
Their targets were members of the Right Club, an extreme pro-Nazi society led by aristocrat and Tory MP Archibald Ramsay. The Right Club wanted to bring down the British government and forge an alliance with Hitler.
These people are real fellow travellers of the right. They are admirers of Hitler.
The Right Club got their hands on stolen secret documents which could discredit Churchill and prevent America from entering the war.
They believed that the government did not have the interests of the United Kingdom at heart. Treason, unquestionably.
Germany calling. Germany calling.
The rounding up of the Right Club would be the trigger for Churchill and MI5 to lock up all the leading fascist sympathizers in Britain. The treacherous fifth column, which could undermine us from within. It's a story that reveals a little-known side of wartime Britain. A murky world of fascist toffs, disaffected foreign aristocrats, and spies. On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill became British Prime Minister. That day, across the Channel, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg. But Churchill was not just facing an enemy abroad. There was also an enemy within. For nearly a decade, Oswald Mosley and his black shirts had been trying to put Britain on the road to fascism with their brand of violent subversion. But there were others in Britain's fifth column. Hidden away in West London, a small extremist group known as the Right Club was quietly plotting against Churchill. During Churchill's first extraordinary fortnight in power, the Right Club would pose as great a threat to his position as Adolf Hitler. On May the 15th, 1940, with Hitler's panzers sweeping across Europe, Churchill secretly sent the American president Franklin Roosevelt the most desperate plea for help ever written by a British Prime Minister.
I trust you realize, Mr. President, that the voice and force of the United States may count for nothing if they are withheld too long. Immediate needs are the loan of 40 or 50 of your older destroyers.
The American Congress had passed a Neutrality Act which forced America by law to stay out of the war in Europe. Churchill's request was political dynamite. What Churchill didn't know was that inside the American embassy in London, a treacherous American cipher clerk was stealing all his top-secret cables to Roosevelt. Churchill also didn't know that the clerk had been recruited into the Right Club by its leader, a Tory MP in his own party. For the clerk and the MP, Churchill's cable of May the 15th was gold dust.
The damage, were it to be done, would be towards Roosevelt, who would have had difficult questions to answer on a policy of continuing neutrality, and yet entering into a risky and incriminating correspondence with Winston Churchill.
The Right Club's plan was to expose Churchill and Roosevelt's secret correspondence to the world and whip up American opinion to ensure Roosevelt cut Churchill off. Britain would then be forced to make peace with Hitler. How had one of Churchill's own MPs come so close to treason? The MP and founder of the Right Club was Captain Archibald Maule Ramsay. Ramsay and his wife, Ismay, were blue-blooded aristocracy. He was descended from the Earls of Dalhousie, and she was the daughter of a viscount. Their country seat was Kelly Castle near Arbroath. Educated at Eton and Sandhurst, Ramsay was an arch-patriot and devout Catholic. Ramsay served in World War I. He was wounded and survived. The horror and waste of millions of lives instilled in many of Ramsay's generation a profound conviction that Britain and Germany must never go to war again. But the post-war world turned hostile for aristocrats like Ramsay. The growth of labor and the unions at home, the threat of Bolshevism and revolution blowing from the continent.
There was a general unease throughout the whole of society. I think the aristocracy and the upper classes in particular felt that their old world was disappearing.
On top of all this came economic depression. In 1931, in this troubling world, Archibald Ramsay was elected to Parliament.
In his first years in Parliament, he's remarkably undistinguished. In fact, the most senior position he holds is that of parliamentary representative to the Potato Marketing Board. He never rises above this level.
For Ramsay, parliamentary democracy was failing the country. Along with other like-minded MPs and friends, he began to look elsewhere for solutions to Britain's and the world's ills.
Everyone felt that the world was falling to bits, that democracy no longer worked. And I think people felt that perhaps the only way through was to have different forms of government.
One inspiration was Adolf Hitler. To Ramsay and his friends, he seemed to be sorting out the economic mess, and they were enthusiastic in calling for closer ties with Germany.
Fascism in those days wasn't the dirty word that it is today. It exuded what the upper classes in this country thought they'd lost: glamour, power, confidence, and a sense of being unchallenged.
This isn't Berlin. It's London, 1936, the funeral of the German ambassador. Senior politicians and peers of the realm made an elaborate show of respect.
A salute of 19 guns was fired in Hyde Park, and Lord Mounsell, Sir John Simon and Mr. Anthony Eden walked in the funeral cortege as it moved slowly to Victoria Station.
The pomp and ceremony masked a fundamental Nazi doctrine: anti-Semitism. But the uncomfortable truth was that prejudice against Jews was already part of 1930s Britain.
Behind everything in Britain, there was a kind of social anti-Semitism where people found it perfectly acceptable to crack jokes about Jews, where Jews were not admitted to golf clubs and all that kind of thing. And it's always seemed to me, as the basis on which more extreme anti-Semitism can build itself.
For Ramsay, the penny began to drop. The Nazis decreed the ills of the world, Bolshevism and Judaism, were two sides of the same evil coin.
Ramsay had been violently anti-Bolshevik throughout the interwar period, but it's only in the late 30s that somehow he connects it all with the Jewish threat. There was an Irish Catholic priest called Father Denis Fahy who wrote quite a famous book proving that the Russian Bolshevism was entirely run by Jews. Captain Ramsay was one of those who read that book and believed it.
By January 1938, Ramsay had become a fanatical anti-Semite. He wasn't alone. He joined the secretive and extreme Nordic League. At one of their meetings, he spoke of the need to end Jewish control, proclaiming,
"If we don't do it constitutionally, we'll do it with steel."
He starts to become obsessed with what he sees as a world Jewish conspiracy. He starts to see it in almost everything that happens, this hidden hand of world Jewry, and he becomes convinced that for its own nefarious reasons, this Jewish conspiracy is trying to drag Britain into an entirely destructive and unnecessary war with Germany.
In May 1939, with Britain on the brink of war, Ramsay took matters into his own hands. He formed a secret society and invited his friends and fellow travelers of the right to join. He called it the Right Club. Ramsay told his recruits,
Hitler is a splendid fellow with whom we should be proud to be friends.
Within 3 months, Ramsay had recruited an impressive list of the cream of the British aristocracy and upper class.
Well, this is the Right Club list, the list of all those names, 230 of them, all in Captain Ramsay's handwriting, and some of them very important people indeed. We've got Lord Carnegie, Lord Column Stewart MP, Lord Sempill, Sir Alexander Walker of Johnny Walker's Whisky gave £100, which in 1940 was a very great deal of money. And the Duke of Wellington, yes. They're all there.
These people are real fellow travellers of the right. They are admirers of Hitler. They are extreme anti-Semites. Indeed, they have a little badge with an eagle pouncing on a snake with the letters PJ on, which means perish Judah.
The formation of the Right Club had set Archibald Ramsay on a dangerous path. With the help of a glamorous Russian aristocrat and an American spy, it would lead him to treachery. By May 1939, Archibald Ramsay had launched his Right Club with a galaxy of high-placed members. Its first secret meeting was even chaired by the Duke of Wellington.
The social standing of the people who subscribed to the Right Club is beyond question. How well organized they were and whether they understood what they had got themselves involved with is, of course, another matter.
Over pink inns and canapes, members of the Right Club would torment each other with talk of the global Jewish conspiracy. Ramsay's aim was to forge an alliance with the Nazis, but his tactics at first seemed more comic than subversive.
It was a secret club, and he told his members what to do. Silly things like they were told not to buy from Marks and Spencer, to support their local tradesmen. It was really a little bit bonkers.
One of the most prominent and exotic members of the Right Club was its self-styled political secretary, Anna Wolkoff. In the coming months, her activities would have explosive consequences. Anna Wolkoff had arrived in London as a child when her father was appointed naval attaché at the Russian Imperial Embassy. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Wolkoffs found themselves in permanent exile.
Anna Volkov was very upset by the loss of their family fortunes. They had been very wealthy prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, and afterwards her father, who was an admiral, he was reduced to running small tea rooms, the Russian tea rooms in South Kensington.
Anna Wolkoff was an expert dressmaker. In 1937, one of her designs featured in Vogue. Her talent was an entree to high society. Her client list boasted Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. But it was at her parents' tea room, a haven for exiled White Russians and anti-Bolsheviks, that Wolkoff's right-wing views were shaped by the foreign clientele that passed daily through the doors. Archibald Ramsay and Anna Wolkoff were near neighbours. For Ramsay, the Wolkoff story brought home the threat of Bolshevism. In June 1939, he signed up an enthusiastic Anna Wolkoff to the Right Club.
Volkoff was quite a sinister woman, staunchly anti-Semitic, staunchly anti-Bolshevist. And so she felt very much at home amongst the more extreme members of the Right Club.
Within weeks of joining, Anna Wolkoff travelled to Germany, to forge links between the Right Club and the Nazis. She boasted she'd met Rudolf Hess and wrote to a friend.
I have always been well instructed on the Jewish peril, but to tell the truth, until the arrival of the brave Hitler, people ridiculed us.
In Wolkoff, Ramsey found a mirror for his own virulent anti-Semitism and his determination to avoid war with Germany.
The Ramsey phenomena is quite extraordinary. He speaks to fears, and there is a lot of fear about at this time. Very few people in Britain really want to go to war.
But in September 1939, war came.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, a state of war would exist between us.
Ramsey's dream of keeping Britain out of the war was shattered. He officially shut down the club, and many of his high-profile members melted away to their country estates. But secretly, Ramsey pressed on with a core of his inner circle.
On the outbreak of war, members of the Right Club went underground, but worked very hard for what they saw as the next major achievement, which would be an honourably negotiated peace.
But Ramsey was struggling with how that new aim might be achieved. With the stakes raised, he resorted to clandestine operations under the cover of darkness.
Ramsey was organising activities, but with around him a very reduced number of people. Almost all the important people who'd been members were no longer involved. And one gets the impression that the rump of the Right Club suddenly became a little group where women were rather important.
They wandered around Chelsea at the dead of night, sticking stickers on doors and lampposts and cars. They started doing things that were absurd and ineffectual.
There was half a dozen women who used to meet regularly at the Russian tea rooms, and they all had the same wild ideas of putting up sticky backs that booed when Churchill came on the screen at the cinema, and spreading the gospel around about the menace of the Jews.
It seemed that any threat the Right Club posed had vanished. But with the arrival in London of a subversive American, Ramsey's Right Club were about to get right back on track.
What changed all this was the advent on the scene of an American called Tyler Kent, who was a cipher clerk at the American Embassy.
Tyler Gatewood Kent was 29 and rather dapper. He had joined the Foreign Service as a junior clerk and was posted to the US Embassy in Moscow. In October 1939, Kent was transferred to London, by which time he spoke excellent Russian. Kent loathed communism and quickly fell in with the Russian community in London. He soon began an affair with the beautiful wife of a Russian exile. In the new year of 1940, at the Russian tea rooms, Kent was introduced through these connections to Anna Wolkoff. Kent was an isolationist, a powerful movement dedicated to keeping America out of Europe's war. This was all music to Anna Wolkoff's ears.
Isolationism prevailed in the United States. Most of the newspapers were wholly opposed to America getting engaged in the folly of another European war.
A few weeks later, As their friendship grew, Kent told Wolkoff that he had been up to something at the American embassy. His revelation was a bombshell, which went right to the top of the British and American governments. At the time, the United States was, by an act of Congress, a neutral country, and publicly, President Franklin Roosevelt championed that neutrality.
My every act and thought has been directed to the end of preserving the peace of the world, and more particularly the peace of the United States.
But privately, following the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had been exchanging messages with Churchill that were, in tone, anything but neutral. Churchill sent his highly confidential cables via the American embassy in London. Tyler Kent's job was to encrypt them, so he had access to every one.
Tyler Kent started taking copies of correspondence which he considered interesting. Correspondence between President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Now, that was political dynamite.
Kent realized that behind his public statements, Roosevelt, merely in exchanging private messages with Churchill, was playing a dangerous game.
There is no question that Roosevelt was taking a huge political risk by even contemplating what would appear to be a very obvious breach of the Neutrality Act.
Tyler Kent took copies of the Roosevelt-Churchill cables back to his flat. He also copied hundreds of other dispatches. In March 1940, Kent invited Anna Wolkoff to view the collection. He would end up amassing well over 1,000 stolen documents. Anna Wolkoff had hit the jackpot. She now introduced Kent to Archibald Ramsay. He was invited to view the stolen stash of secret embassy papers. Kent was the perfect and treacherous foil for Ramsay. Ramsay invited him into his inner circle.
His obsession with isolationism was every bit as finely focused as Ramsay's anti-Semitism. So this was a perfect collision of egos. They were both anti-Jew, they were both anti-Bolshevik, they were both very much anti-Churchill, and this is where Ramsay saw his great opportunity.
On May the 15th, 1940, into Tyler Kent's hands fell Churchill's desperate plea to Roosevelt for help.
Immediate needs are the loan of 40 or 50 of your older destroyers.
The proposition that America should even contemplate supplying war materiel to the United Kingdom was a political bombshell.
For Tyler Kent and Archibald Ramsay, it was the smoking gun.
The information that Kent was putting on offer effectively was the written proof that there was a major conspiracy, that Churchill and the other warmongers were secretly engaged in a deliberate campaign to bring in the United States and create the circumstances for a new world war, which was precisely what the Right Club and their adherents were opposed to.
Ramsay believed he had his ammunition.
The intention was that Ramsay would expose this in the House of Commons.
The result would be explosive, and for Ramsay, it would be the defining moment of his political career.
They believed that the government did not have the interests of the United Kingdom at heart. And it wasn't just a matter of negotiating, they actively supported the idea of the Germans helping to remove the government. Treason, unquestionably.
But there was something Ramsay and the Right Club plotters did not know. For the past 9 months, MI5 and its most enigmatic spymaster had been watching every move they made. Unknown to Winston Churchill, he was the intended victim of a plot by Archibald Ramsay and the Right Club. But unknown to the conspirators, they were up against a formidable opponent. His name was Maxwell Knight, MI5 officer and agent runner in charge of counter-subversion.
Maxwell Knight was one of the most extraordinarily charismatic but intuitive intelligence officers, one of the great case officers of all time.
Knight ran his agents not from an office at MI5, but from his own apartment in Dolphin Square, Pimlico. He was enigmatic, unorthodox, and full of surprises.
He was a natural historian, and by that I mean that he often had frogs and snakes and insects in his pockets. He moved in that Chelsea bohemian circle and seemed to know just about everybody.
But back in the 1920s, Knight had himself flirted with the extreme right and was all too familiar with the murky world of disaffected aristocracy and fascist thugs.
His background is really very strange. He was a member of the Fascisti, the original, rather eccentric fascist party. And he seems to have moved from that into MI5. He was certainly well established in MI5 by 1931.
Knight had turned away from fascism. He now believed it was a threat to national security. But his links to the extreme right would prove vital in his pursuit of Britain's fifth column. Since 1939, Knight had been keeping an eye on the Right Club because one of its senior members was William Joyce, a hardline anti-Semite and Mosley's former right-hand man. Knight knew Joyce was capable of real treachery.
He knew Joyce really quite well. Joyce was an eccentric, unusual character, a street fighter, a thug. He got his face very badly scarred as a consequence of confronting communists. Joyce became a pretty serious target.
Just before war broke out, William Joyce escaped Knight's grasp. He fled to Germany, becoming infamous, broadcasting Nazi propaganda from Berlin as Lord Haw.
Germany calling. Germany calling.
Joyce's uncensored broadcasts made him a fascinating enemy to the British public.
The BBC did a report at the beginning of 1940 which showed that William Joyce had a regular listening audience of 18 million people. The BBC 9 o'clock news, the main news programme each evening, 24 million. Therefore, William Joyce is dangerous.
Knight now asked one of his most trusted agents to infiltrate the Right Club. Her name was Marjorie Amor. Posing as an extreme anti-Semite, Amor began visiting the Russian tea rooms. Her target? The Right Club's political secretary, Anna Volkov.
Marjorie Amor was a very key person because she worked with Anna Volkov and found out what Anna Volkov was getting up to. She was a regular visitor to the Russian tea rooms where the inner circle met. So she became very much part of it.
Volkov boasted to Amor about her contacts at foreign embassies. She claimed she was using them to bypass the censor and send secret messages to Right Club sympathizers in Europe. Amor reported back to Knight. She also uncovered the Right Club's big secret, the identity of Anna Volkov's agent in the American embassy. His name was Tyler Kent. Kent's job, she reported, was to encrypt highly secret information which he appeared to be stealing and showing to Volkov. If that material were to fall into the hands of someone like William Joyce, the result could be catastrophic for Britain's war effort. Knight decided to set a trap. He wanted to see if the Right Club really would pass information to the enemy. But he needed a go-between who could impress Volkov with his fascist credentials. He turned to his old friend, Captain James McGurk Hughes. McGurk Hughes was a shadowy soldier of fortune. He knew William Joyce of old, and he was now a member of the Right Club. But he was also a double agent, working for Maxwell Knight. Berlin. Hughes's job was to get Anna Wolkoff to send it to him. On the 9th of April 1940, the stakes were raised as the war escalated. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. The Nazi Western advance had begun. Fears at home of a German invasion were growing. For Maxwell Knight, it was more critical than ever that all Nazi sympathizers in Britain should be stamped out. Knight waited. It was a pivotal moment. On the very same day of the German advance, McGurk Hughes met Anna Wolkoff at the Russian tea rooms. Hughes asked Wolkoff if she could get a letter past the censor to Germany. Springing the trap, he produced the fake letter, addressed to William Joyce. He told Wolkoff it was written by one of Joyce's close friends and contained some good anti-Jewish stuff. Anna took the bait.
In a sense, Wolkoff was so convinced of the rightness of her cause that she was prepared to compromise British security. I'm not quite sure the extent to which she realized quite how serious some of the stuff was.
Wolkoff even added her own personal note, signing off with the Right Club's moniker PJ, Perish Judah.
This is a pretty serious poisoned chalice, but she absolutely accepts it. And worst of all, she then passes it on. She relays it to a courier. So she's really hanged, drawn, and quartered.
What Wolkoff didn't know was that the courier was yet another of Knight's agents. Knight now had his proof. The Right Club were willing to pass information to the enemy, William Joyce. Ramsay, an MP and pillar of the establishment, seemed fully prepared to commit such treachery. But instead of immediately arresting the conspirators, Maxwell Knight waited.
Why was he playing a waiting game? I think he was convinced that eventually he could make use of all this because he'd been trying to press for people on the extreme right to be put in prison long before this. And the discovery of a plot, if it could ripen properly, would give a great deal of strength to this idea of actually doing something about the right in Britain. He thought it could be used.
Knight had his eye on a bigger prize, but he knew he needed more than a faked letter to round up the entire British fifth column. What he didn't know was Ramsay's Right Club was yet to yield its greatest secret. In May 1940, Winston Churchill faced extreme danger. The Nazi war machine was knocking at Britain's door.
The Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history.
At the very moment the German armed forces are smashing through the Low Countries and into France, Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister. And this is a decisive moment. Now Britain is within range of being invaded.
The threat of a German invasion brought into focus for MI5 the issue of what to do about Britain's fascists. It now became imperative for Maxwell Knight, the spy master in charge of counter-subversion, to strike at Britain's fifth column. And with Churchill now calling the shots, he had a powerful ally.
As a consequence of Churchill coming to power, there was a complete change of political view about how the issues of internal security should be handled.
In a feverish fortnight of political maneuvers and MI5 action, Knight embarked on his plan to try to eliminate Britain's enemies within.
This is all part and parcel of a much more aggressive stance being taken by MI5 and Special Branch as to what the potential traitors in Britain's midst might be up to.
Knight first moved against the Right Club plotters. He set his sights on the treacherous American spy, Tyler Kent. Knight went to the US Embassy with news that Tyler Kent was passing secret information to the Right Club. To arrest him, he also needed Kent's diplomatic immunity to be dropped.
The Americans were a little concerned that they hadn't been told anything about this before. But at any rate, Ambassador Kennedy gave permission for Kent to be arrested.
On Monday, May the 20th, 1940, 10 days into Churchill's premiership, Tyler Kent got a nasty surprise.
They swooped and discovered him.
Tyler Kent?
And a young woman.
Get up.
But also a vast number of documents from the American Embassy. A really vast number.
Among these documents was Churchill's desperate cable to Roosevelt of May the 15th, asking for the loan of destroyers. Kent had stolen the dynamite, but was intercepted before he could detonate it. But that wasn't all. There, stashed away, was the Red Book. Ramsay had given the Right Club's membership list to Kent for safekeeping, believing his diplomatic immunity would protect him. In one fell swoop, Knight had foiled the plot that could have left Britain to fight Hitler alone. And with the Red Book, he now had a direct link to Anna Wolkoff and Archibald Ramsay.
The raid on 47 Gloucester Place was dramatic because it served to incriminate the other people involved, and this resulted in a sitting member of Parliament being detained under the Defence of the Realm regulations.
The raid against Ramsay, Kent and Wolkoff gave Knight the evidence he needed. He could now press the case for a full-blown roundup of all other fascist sympathisers in Britain.
What he now has is something which looks like a plot and which can be used in order to persuade.
The security service, they had a very clear idea of the categories of people who should be regarded as enemy aliens and interned, and that included people who were potential fifth columnists.
But one person was standing in Knight's way. The Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, the minister responsible for internal security, was resisting any move against British subjects. Singling out Mosley's fascists, he remarked,
"There is no evidence that they would be likely to assist the enemy. In my view, it would be a mistake to strike at this organization."
Anderson believed that Mosley had told his supporters to fight against Hitler.
Given instructions on the outbreak of war that the BUF would now serve King.
Day, I attended a meeting at the Home Office. Anderson said he thought it would be a mistake to imprison Mosley and no empire.
The next day, Anderson had a sudden change of heart. And Guy Liddell's diary reveals the hidden hand of persuasion.
It seems the Prime Minister takes a strong view about the internment of all fifth columnists at this moment, and that he's left the Home Secretary in no doubt about his views. What seems to have moved him more than anything was the Tyler Kent case.
Finally, Knight got what he wanted. Britain's defence laws were toughened up.
MI5 felt vindicated that there had been a genuine, serious threat, and based on that, there should be widespread detention of fifth columnists and internment of enemy aliens. Churchill may not have been the planner behind this, but he certainly took the gloves off.
On May the 23rd, 1940, Sir Oswald Mosley and his wife, Lady Diana Mitford, were detained. Over the following weeks, 1,000 known extremists were also interned, 750 of them members of Mosley's British Union of Fascists.
In fact, the whole thing is moved so that people can be put in jail not because it's been proved they've done anything, but because they might do something. I think that's the big change. And what the French call a rafle, which is when the police go and gather everybody in without trial for as long as the government wanted.
On June the 4th, 1940, following the retreat from Dunkirk, Churchill, safe in the knowledge that any fifth column threat had been quashed, made his most famous call to arms.
We shall defend our island, whatever the...
But what is often overlooked, and was never recorded, is the passage in his speech that reveals this untold struggle during his first fortnight in power, a struggle to cripple the enemy within.
Parliament has given us the powers to put down fifth column activities with a strong hand, and we shall use those powers without the slightest hesitation until we are satisfied, and more than satisfied, that this malignancy in our midst has been effectively stamped out.
Churchill's correspondence with Roosevelt would now remain secret until long after the end of the war. On November the 5th, 1940, the US president won an historic third term. With the right club plotters locked up, no damage was done to his election campaign. Roosevelt made his famous public U-turn on foreign policy.
If Great Britain goes down, it is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun.
Roosevelt turned US public opinion away from the isolationists and paved the way for Congress to pass the deal that would become known as Lend-Lease, a deal that would play a major part in funding Britain's war. But what became of the trio of right club plotters who'd so threatened America joining Britain? In the autumn of 1940, Tyler Kent and Anna Wolkoff were tried separately at the Old Bailey. They were each found guilty of violating the Official Secrets Act. Kent was sentenced to 7 years, Wolkoff to 10. As for Archibald Ramsay, in a few short months, he had been brought down from respected aristocrat and MP to national disgrace. No charges were ever brought against him, but he was sent to Brixton Prison and spent the rest of the war out of the way.
We'll never know exactly how important it was to detain the likes of Oswald Mosley, Ramsay, and his other fellow travellers of the right, because Britain wasn't invaded, and we don't know what damage potentially they could have done to the war effort.
The Right Club was a brief but infamous chapter of British history. Was it a dangerous fifth column threat? Or was it an almost comic bunch of anti-Semitic amateurs who became pawns in a bigger game of wartime politics? The answer is a little bit of both.
What makes the Right Club so fascinating today is that the survival of Britain largely depended on keeping the sea lanes of the North Atlantic open. And that meant Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease was put in jeopardy by Tyler Kent and the Right Club, Anna Wolkoff and Archibald Ramsay.
We see people who are eccentric, demented, obsessed, people who have repellent views, people you might almost describe as eccentric to the point of being bonkers. But they had the ability to do real harm because through their links with Tyler Kent, they were in touch with someone who might have been able to transmit very important secrets at a vital moment in the war. In that sense, the Right Club could have potentially changed the course of the war, could have potentially changed the course of history.